August 1714, the death of Queen Anne leaves Britain without an heir. As political chaos looms, a 54-year-old German prince who barely speaks English arrives on British shores to claim the throne. This unlikely monarch, George Louis of Hanover, would become King George I, founder of a dynasty that would rule for over 3 centuries. Born and raised in continental Europe, George was the 52nd in line to the British throne until the Act of Settlement changed everything. A seasoned military commander who fought against the Ottoman Turks, he now faced a different battle, winning over a nation that viewed him as a foreign intruder. While most remember the Georgian era for its elegance and cultural achievements, few recognize how this German-speaking outsider laid the groundwork for modern British democracy. Under his reign, the powers of the monarchy diminished as Parliament rose, forever altering the balance of British politics. What drives a middle-aged foreign prince to abandon his homeland for a kingdom that views him with suspicion? How did this seemingly reluctant king navigate religious tensions, political intrigue, and the infamous South Sea bubble financial crisis? And how did his personal tragedies, including imprisoning his own wife and the bitter estrangement from his son, shape his reign? This is the untold story of King George I, the monarch who, despite his broken English, would help forge the identity of modern Britain and establish one of history's most enduring royal houses. Early life. George was born on May 28, 1660 in Hanover, within the Duchy of Brunswick-Lüneburg in the Holy Roman Empire. He was the eldest son of Ernest Augustus, Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg, and Sophia of the Palatinate. Through his mother, he was the great-grandson of King James I of England, as she was the daughter of Elizabeth Stuart, Queen of Bohemia. For the first year of his life, George was the sole heir to his father's German territories, as well as those of his 3 childless uncles. In 1661, his younger brother, Frederick Augustus, was born, and the 2 boys, nicknamed Gorgon and Gustchen within the family, were raised together. In 1662, the family relocated to Osnabrück when Ernest Augustus was appointed ruler of the Prince-Bishopric of Osnabrück. There, they lived at Eiberg Castle until 1673, when they moved to the newly built Schloss Osnabrück. During their early years, George's parents spent nearly a year, 1664 to 1665, in Italy for health reasons, but his mother remained actively involved in his upbringing, maintaining frequent correspondence with his governess. Sophia gave birth to 4 more sons and a daughter, and she described George as a responsible, conscientious child who set a strong example for his siblings. By 1675, the family's political future was uncertain. George's eldest uncle had died without children, but his 2 remaining uncles had married, meaning their estates could pass to their own sons if they had any. Aware of this uncertainty, Ernest Augustus took the young George under his wing, training him in hunting, riding, and military affairs. At just 15, George accompanied his father on campaign during the Franco-Dutch War to gain practical battle experience. In 1679, another uncle died without an heir, making Ernest Augustus the Duke of Kallenberg-Göttingen, with Hanover as its capital. Meanwhile, George's only surviving uncle, George William of Celle, had legitimized his only daughter, Sophia Dorothea, through marriage to his longtime mistress, but had no other children. Under Salic law, which restricted inheritance to male descendants, George and his brothers now had a clearer path to inheriting their father and uncle's territories. To further secure their holdings, the family adopted the principle of primogeniture in 1682, ensuring that George, as the eldest son, would inherit everything rather than having to divide the lands among his brothers. Marriage. In 1682, George married his cousin, Sophia Dorothea of Celle, the daughter of his uncle, George William. This political union was arranged primarily to consolidate family wealth and secure additional income that would otherwise fall outside Salic inheritance laws. Initially, George's mother opposed the marriage due to Sophia Dorothea's maternal lineage. Her mother, Eleanor, was of lower French nobility, and her status as a legitimized child. However, she eventually accepted the match, recognizing its strategic benefits. Soon after their marriage, George and his brother Frederick Augustus joined the Great Turkish War, fighting in the Battle of Vienna in 1683. Meanwhile, Sophia Dorothea gave birth to their first child, George Augustus. The following year, tensions arose within the family when Frederick Augustus discovered that, due to the adoption of primogeniture, he would no longer receive a share of their father's lands. This led to a prolonged estrangement between him and both his father and brother, lasting until his death in battle in 1690. With Hanover's growing political importance, Ernest Augustus was named an elector of the Holy Roman Empire in 1692, further strengthening George's future prospects as the heir to both his father's electorate and his uncle's duchy. Meanwhile, Sophia Dorothea gave birth to a second child, a daughter named after herself, in 1687. However, their marriage soon deteriorated. George became increasingly distant from his wife, preferring the company of his mistress, Melusine von der Schulenburg. In response, Sophia Dorothea developed a romantic relationship with the Swedish nobleman Philip Christoph von Königsmarck. Their affair became the subject of scandal, as they allegedly planned to elope. Despite warnings from the Hanoverian court, including George's brothers and mother, the couple refused to end their liaison. In July 1694, Königsmarck mysteriously disappeared. According to diplomatic sources from Hanover's rivals, he was murdered, possibly with George's knowledge, and his body was allegedly thrown into the river Lane, weighed down with stones. Some rumors suggested he had been dismembered and buried beneath the palace floorboards. However, Hanoverian sources, including George's mother, denied any involvement or knowledge of Königsmarck's fate. Shortly thereafter, George had his marriage to Sophia Dorothea annulled, not on the grounds of adultery but on the charge that she had abandoned her husband. With her father's consent, she was imprisoned in Alden House in Celle, where she remained for over 30 years until her death. She was forbidden from seeing her children or remarrying but was provided with a household, staff, and an income. She was allowed to take supervised carriage rides outside the estate but was otherwise confined to her residence. Following the annulment, George continued his relationship with Melusine von der Schulenburg, who openly acted as his consort from 1698 onward. The couple had 3 daughters together, born in 1692, 1693, and 1701. Electoral reign. George became Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg, commonly known as Hanover, and a prince-elector of the Holy Roman Empire following the death of his father, Ernest Augustus, on January 23, 1698. However, the Prince-Bishopric of Osnabrück, which Ernest Augustus had held since 1661, passed to another ruler. As Elector of Hanover, George presided over a culturally rich court that attracted notable figures such as philosopher and mathematician Gottfried Leibniz and composers George Friedrich Handel and Agostino Stefani. Shortly after George's accession, a shift in the English and Scottish royal succession took place. Prince William, Duke of Gloucester, who was next in line after Queen and died in 1700. To secure a Protestant succession, the English Parliament passed the Act of Settlement 1701, naming George's mother, Sophia, as the heir should both William III and die without surviving children. Despite over 50 Catholic claimants having stronger hereditary claims, they were excluded due to religious restrictions. Efforts to persuade any of them to convert to Protestantism were largely unsuccessful. In August 1701, George was awarded the Order of the Garter. 6 weeks later, the exiled Catholic King James II of England died, and in March 1702, William III followed, making Anne the new queen. Sophia thus became heiress presumptive to the English throne. Although she was 35 years older than Anne, she remained in good health and actively worked to secure the Hanoverian succession. However, it was George who understood the intricacies of English politics, leading to further legislation in 1705 that naturalized Sophia and her heirs as English subjects and established a regency council to oversee the transition of power. Meanwhile, George's inheritance continued to grow. In 1705, he acquired the Principality of Lüneburg-Grubenhagen, centered at Celle, after the death of his last surviving uncle. Military and political affairs. Shortly after George took power in Hanover, the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, erupted. The conflict revolved around the contested claim of Philip, grandson of France's King Louis XIV, to the Spanish throne. Fearing excessive French influence, England, the Dutch Republic, the Holy Roman Empire, and various German states, including Hanover, opposed Philip's succession. As part of the war effort, George led an invasion of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel, a neighboring state aligned with France. He personally oversaw some battle orders, and the invasion was successful with minimal casualties. In recognition of Hanover's role in the war, England and the Dutch Republic acknowledged its prior annexation of Saxe-Lauenburg, a territory previously seized by George's uncle. In 1706, the Elector of Bavaria was stripped of his titles for siding with France, and the following year, George was promoted to Imperial Field Marshal, commanding forces along the Rhine. His military career, however, faced setbacks, partly due to deception by his ally, the Duke of Marlborough, who led him into a diversionary attack, and partly because Emperor Joseph I redirected crucial war funds for other purposes. Despite this, German princes commended George's leadership. In 1708, he was formally confirmed as a prince-elector by the Holy Roman Empire, cementing his influence. By 1709, George stepped down as field marshal, retiring from active military service. In 1710, he was appointed arch-treasurer of the empire, a role previously held by the Elector Palatine. The war concluded in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht, which allowed Philip to retain the Spanish throne but barred him from inheriting the French crown, restoring the balance of power. Accession to the British throne. Although England and Scotland both recognized Anne as their queen, only the English Parliament had formally designated Sophia of Hanover as her heir. Scotland, however, had not yet settled the issue of succession. In 1703, the Scottish Estates of Parliament passed a bill stating that unless England granted Scotland full trade access, the Scottish Parliament would choose its own successor to Queen Anne, one who might not be the same as England's choice. Initially, Queen Anne refused to approve the bill, but in 1704, she conceded, allowing it to become law as the Act of Security. In response, the English Parliament passed the Alien Act 1705, threatening to cut off trade with Scotland unless the Scots agreed to the Hanoverian succession. Faced with economic consequences, both parliaments eventually negotiated the Treaty of Union, 1707, merging England and Scotland into a single kingdom, Great Britain. This treaty formally established the Hanoverian succession, following the guidelines of the Act of Settlement 1701. As a result, the Union created one of the largest free trade zones in Europe during the 18th century, strengthening both economies and ensuring a stable political transition. Political divisions and succession. Whig politicians believed that Parliament had the authority to determine the royal succession and bestow it upon the nearest Protestant heir. Many Tories, however, supported the hereditary right of the Catholic Stuart line, who were closer relatives to Queen Anne. In 1710, George publicly declared that his succession to the British throne was based on hereditary right, as the Stuarts had forfeited their claim. This statement aimed to counter the Whig argument that Parliament had simply granted him the throne, while also reassuring Tories that he was not a usurper. On May 28, 1714, George's mother, Electress Sophia, died suddenly at the age of 83 while rushing to seek shelter from the rain in the gardens at Herrenhausen. With Sophia's passing, George became the heir presumptive to Queen Anne, whose health was rapidly deteriorating. Aware that British politicians were maneuvering for influence, he swiftly revised the membership of the Regency Council, which would assume power upon Anne's death, and suffered a stroke and died on August 1, 1714. The list of regents was opened, its members sworn in, and George was proclaimed King of Great Britain and Ireland. However, due to unfavorable winds delaying his passage from The Hague, he did not arrive in Britain until September 18. His coronation took place at Westminster Abbey on October 20, sparking riots in over 20 English towns. Although George primarily resided in Britain after 1714, he visited Hanover in 1716, 1719, 1720, 1723, and 1725, spending about one-fifth of his reign in his German homeland. In 1716, Parliament unanimously repealed a clause in the Act of Settlement that had previously prohibited the monarch from leaving Britain without permission. During George's absences, power was vested in a Regency Council rather than in his son, George Augustus, Prince of Wales. Wars and rebellions. Shortly after George's accession, the Whigs secured a landslide victory in the 1715 general election. Many Tories, bitter about their defeat, sympathized with the Jacobites, who sought to restore Anne's Catholic half-brother, James Francis Edward Stuart, known to supporters as James III and VIII and to opponents as the Pretender. This discontent fueled a Jacobite rebellion, later known as the 15. The uprising, led by Lord Mar, a former Scottish Secretary of State, gained momentum in Scotland, where Jacobite support was strongest. However, the rebellion quickly unraveled due to poor planning, lack of military coordination, and James's late arrival with insufficient funds and weapons. By early 1716, the rebellion had collapsed. James and Lord Mar fled to France, while the British government imposed some executions and land forfeitures. Nevertheless, George showed leniency, using the forfeited estate's income to fund Scottish schools and reduce national debt. George's distrust of the Tories further consolidated Whig dominance. Under his reign, the Septennial Act of 1715 extended the maximum duration of Parliament to 7 years, ensuring that Whigs remained in power for an extended period. The Tories would not regain control of government for nearly 50 years. Family conflict and foreign policy. George's relationship with his son, Prince George Augustus, had always been strained, but it worsened after his accession. The Prince of Wales opposed many of his father's policies, particularly those that expanded religious freedoms and sought to increase Hanover's influence at Sweden's expense. In 1717, tensions escalated when George insisted that the Duke of Newcastle, his Lord Chamberlain, be a godparent at his grandson's baptism. The Prince of Wales, who disliked Newcastle, insulted him at the ceremony. Newcastle misinterpreted the insult as a duel challenge, leading to a severe rift between father and son. The king banished his son from the royal residence, forcing him to relocate to Leicester House, which became a hub for political opposition to George's rule. Though a reconciliation was later orchestrated by Robert Walpole and the Princess of Wales, the king and his son never fully mended their relationship. Despite internal tensions, George played an active role in shaping British foreign policy. In 1717, he helped establish the Triple Alliance, an anti-Spanish coalition of Britain, France, and the Dutch Republic. In 1718, the Holy Roman Empire joined, forming the Quadruple Alliance. The War of the Quadruple Alliance soon followed, reigniting tensions from the War of the Spanish Succession. Spain had previously accepted that Philip V, grandson of Louis XIV of France, could become King of Spain only if he renounced any claim to the French throne. However, after Louis XIV's 1715 death, Philip attempted to reverse this agreement. In 1719, Spain supported a Jacobite invasion of Scotland, hoping to depose George. A storm scattered the Spanish fleet, limiting the invasion force to only 300 Spanish troops, who landed on Scotland's west coast. They set up a base at Donan Castle, but it was quickly destroyed by the British Navy. The Jacobites struggled to recruit local Highlanders, amassing a poorly armed force of only 1,000 men. The rebellion was swiftly crushed at the Battle of Glenshiel, where British artillery overpowered the Jacobite forces. The Scottish rebels scattered, and the remaining Spanish soldiers surrendered. The failed invasion confirmed that the Jacobites posed no serious threat to George's government. Meanwhile, Spain's ambitions suffered further setbacks, as its army performed poorly against the Quadruple Alliance. As a result, Spain and France remained separate monarchies, securing the European balance of power. Additionally, Hanover gained new territories following the Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, a long-standing conflict between Sweden and Russia over control of the Baltic region. As part of the war settlement, Sweden ceded the regions of Bremen and Verden to Hanover in 1719, with Hanover paying Sweden a monetary compensation for the land. Electoral reign. George inherited the electorate of Hanover in 1698 after the death of his father, Ernest Augustus, who had held the prince-bishopric of Osnabrück. As Duke of Brunswick-Lüneburg, he became a prince-elector of the Holy Roman Empire. His court in Hanover attracted notable figures such as philosopher Gottfried Leibniz and composers George Friedrich Handel and Agostino Stefani. In 1701, the English Act of Settlement designated George's mother, Sophia, as the heir to the English throne if the reigning monarch, William III, and his successor, Queen Anne, died without issue. The law ensured that the throne would pass to the closest Protestant relative, bypassing dozens of Catholic claimants. George played an active role in securing the succession, understanding the complexities of English politics and the necessity of legal provisions to formalize the transition. During the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, George commanded imperial forces and successfully invaded the pro-French Duchy of Brunswick-Wolfenbüttel. His military service earned him the formal confirmation of his status as a prince-elector in 1708. In 1710, he was granted the title of Arch-Treasurer of the Holy Roman Empire. Accession to the British throne. George's mother, Sophia, died in 1714, making him Queen Anne's direct heir. When Anne passed away on August 1, 1714, George was proclaimed King of Great Britain and Ireland. He arrived in Britain on September 18 and was crowned at Westminster Abbey on October 20. His ascension sparked riots in several English towns, reflecting the divided opinions over the Hanoverian succession. Despite being King of Great Britain, George spent about one-fifth of his reign in Hanover, returning multiple times between 1716 and 1725. Parliament repealed a clause in the Act of Settlement that restricted the monarch from leaving Britain without permission. During his absences, a regency council governed instead of his son, George Augustus, the Prince of Wales. Political challenges and rebellions. The Whigs dominated Parliament after their decisive victory in the 1715 general election. Many Tories supported the Jacobites, who sought to restore the Catholic Stuart claimant, James Francis Edward Stuart, the Pretender. A Jacobite uprising in Scotland, known as the 15, was poorly coordinated and swiftly defeated. George adopted a relatively lenient approach, using confiscated Jacobite estates to fund education and pay off national debt. His distrust of the Tories further solidified Whig power. The Septennial Act of 1715 extended Parliament's duration to 7 years, ensuring Whig dominance for decades. However, George's relationship with his son deteriorated due to political and personal disputes. The Prince of Wales aligned himself with opposition factions, and after a heated altercation, George expelled him from the royal household. George played an active role in foreign policy. He helped form the Triple Alliance, 1717, between Britain, France, and the Dutch Republic to counter Spain. The alliance later expanded into the Quadruple Alliance, which prevented the unification of the French and Spanish thrones. Spain supported a Jacobite-led invasion of Scotland in 1719, but British forces crushed the rebellion at the Battle of Glen Shiel. The Great Northern War, 1700 to 1721, concluded with Hanover gaining Swedish territories, including Bremen and Verden. Government and the South Sea Bubble. Unlike in Hanover, where he ruled as an absolute monarch, George had to govern Britain through Parliament. His early ministry included Robert Walpole, Lord Townshend, Lord Stanhope, and Lord Sunderland. Power struggles led to Townshend's dismissal and Walpole's resignation in 1717, leaving Stanhope and Sunderland in control. In 1719, Sunderland introduced the Peerage Bill to limit the creation of new peers, securing his influence in the House of Lords. Walpole successfully opposed the bill, leading to his political resurgence. The biggest crisis of George's reign was the South Sea Bubble of 1720. The South Sea Company assumed a significant portion of Britain's national debt, inflating share prices before a catastrophic market collapse. Many investors, including aristocrats, suffered financial ruin. Although George was in Hanover when the crisis unfolded, he returned to Britain early to manage the fallout. The scandal led to the political downfall of Lord Stanhope, who died under stress, and Lord Sunderland, who resigned in 1721. Robert Walpole took over as de facto Prime Minister, stabilizing the economy and shielding George from direct blame. Despite accusations that the king had accepted South Sea stock as a bribe, records show he paid for his shares and suffered financial losses. Later years and death. By the mid-1720s, Walpole had consolidated power. In 1725, George revived the Order of the Bath, allowing Walpole to reward political allies. George's focus remained on foreign policy, particularly countering Austro-Spanish threats through the Treaty of Hanover, 1725, which aligned Britain with France and Prussia. Despite his reliance on Walpole, George retained the authority to dismiss ministers. Walpole feared being removed but maintained his position until the king's death. During his sixth visit to Hanover, George suffered a stroke on June 9, 1727, while traveling between Delden and Nordhorn. He was taken to Osnabrück, where he died 2 days later, on June 11. Initially buried in the chapel of Lane Palace, his remains were later moved to the mausoleum of King Ernest Augustus in Herrenhausen Gardens after World War II. George was succeeded by his son, who became King George II. Though some expected George II to remove Walpole, the minister's strong parliamentary support ensured his continued dominance. Legacy. George I was often ridiculed by his British subjects. Many contemporaries, such as Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, perceived him as unintelligent due to his reserved demeanor in public. His supposed inability to speak English contributed to his unpopularity, though later evidence suggests that by the end of his reign, he could understand, speak, and write English. In addition to his native German, he was fluent in French, proficient in Latin, and had some knowledge of Italian and Dutch. His treatment of his wife, Sophia Dorothea, became a public scandal. Furthermore, his strong Lutheran faith and oversight of both the Lutheran churches in Hanover and the Church of England led to unease among his Anglican subjects. Many saw him as too German, and rumors of numerous German mistresses circulated, though historian Ragnhild Hatton has argued that these were largely unfounded. In contrast, European perspectives on George I were more favorable. He was viewed as a progressive ruler who supported Enlightenment ideals, tolerated criticism, and permitted freedom of the press. When Voltaire was exiled from Paris in 1726, George granted him sanctuary. He was known for being reserved, financially prudent, and temperate in his personal habits. Unlike other monarchs, he disliked public ceremonies, avoided the royal opera box, and preferred private gatherings where he could play cards. Despite his lack of popularity, many British subjects saw him as a preferable alternative to the Catholic Jacobite claimant, James Stuart. The 19th-century view of George I was shaped by authors such as William Makepeace Thackeray, Walter Scott, and Lord Mahone, who relied on biased accounts like Lord Hervey's memoirs. These works often portrayed him negatively while romanticizing the Jacobite cause. By the 20th century, nationalist and anti-German sentiments further reinforced these interpretations, as seen in the writings of G.K. Chesterton. However, after World War II, as European archives became more accessible and historical biases faded, scholars such as John Beattie and Ragnhild Hatton reassessed George I's reign in a more balanced light. Historian John H. Plum observed that while some accounts exaggerated George's indifference to British affairs and overemphasized his struggles with the English language, he was deeply engaged in foreign policy and court matters. Though often perceived as distant and awkward, private letters to his daughter reveal a more affectionate and genial side. His mother once described him as a man who felt deeply and sincerely, but was more sensitive than he wished to appear. Regardless of his true character, George I ascended a fragile throne and, whether through political skill, strategic caution, or mere circumstance, left it firmly in the hands of the Hanoverians and Parliament. Arms. As King of Great Britain, George I's coat of arms was quartered as follows. First quarter, 3 golden lions passant guardant on a red background, for England, impaled with a red lion rampant within a double traceur flory counterflory on a gold background, for Scotland. Second quarter, 3 golden fleurs de lis on a blue background, for France. Third quarter, a gold harp with silver strings on a blue background, for Ireland. Fourth quarter, Hanoverian territories. Top left, 2 golden lions passant guardant on a red background, for Brunswick. Top right, a golden field scattered with red hearts, featuring a blue lion rampant, for Lüneburg. Bottom, a white horse courant on a red background, for Westphalia. Overall escutcheon, a red shield featuring the golden crown of Charlemagne, representing the dignity of Arch-Treasurer of the Holy Roman Empire.